time to move forward. Our country's leaders are ready to put Wednesday's ugly scene at the Capitol behind them.
One of the darkest days in the history of our nation.
They should have been challenged. Warning shots should have been fired and lethal force should have been used.
So many more can't wipe the ugly scene from their memory and can't help but wonder whether a different mob would have received different treatment.
Insurrectionists, domestic terrorists that had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesting yesterday, they would have been treated very, very differently.
There are 13 days left in President Trump's term. Democrats believe that's too many.
A very dangerous person who should not continue in office.
Tonight, Denver7 brings you 360 coverage of the Capitol chaos aftermath and the next steps for our democracy.
What we saw yesterday was a group of violent rioters undermining the legitimate First Amendment rights of the many thousands who came to peacefully have their voices heard in our nation's capital. Those who violently besieged our capital are the opposite of everything this administration stands for.
She's rarely seen these days. Still, in one of her shortest public statements, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany condemned the anarchists who stormed the U.S. Capitol yesterday. The president remains silent.
His Facebook and Twitter accounts have been locked since last night. The Facebook page actually is locked indefinitely, according to Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg. McEnany's statement marks the most forceful statement yet by an administration official about yesterday's chaos.
And that chaos didn't deter Congress. They got the job done very early this morning. The Electoral College result is certified for President-elect Joe Biden, who is on track for inauguration on January 20th.
We now know one Coloradan was among those arrested yesterday at the Capitol. His family declined our request for an interview. And also, I'm sad to say that just minutes ago, Capitol Police confirmed that one of their officers has died from injuries suffered in the riots.
And the outrageous and violent events yesterday forced tough conversations nationwide. Tonight, Denver7 shines a 360 light on some of the most difficult questions. Should the president be removed? Why weren't Capitol Police better prepared? And did this country's intense political climate fuel what we saw yesterday?
Our team coverage begins tonight with Andrew Dember in Washington, D.C.
And there are growing calls for accountability for what happened yesterday. It obviously starts with the violent demonstrators themselves, but also law enforcement and their response, or lack thereof, as well as the President of the United States, with lawmakers now on both sides of the aisle calling for him to be removed from office. After a night of lawlessness in the nation's capital, Congress finally ratifying the Electoral College vote, cementing Joe Biden's victory on becoming the next president of the United States.
Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes.
In what is traditionally a purely ceremonial process, the joint session of Congress was marred by a violent pro-Trump mob who stormed the Capitol. Following President Trump's speech, repeating his false claims of voter fraud, the violent extremists followed his instructions.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
The rioters, some described as domestic terrorists, breaching barricades with ease, even appearing to get help from and taking selfies with some Capitol Police officers. President-elect Biden blasting Trump and the angry mob that seized the Capitol, but also the law enforcement response.
Don't dare call them protesters. They were a riotous mob.
The Trump fanatics confronting police inside the halls of Congress, some waving Confederate flags, one even making it to Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office. Vice President Pence and other lawmakers whisked away by security, others left hiding in closets and under desks.
It's wrong, and we've got to rebuild our nation.
The attempted takeover taking a deadly turn. 4 people died, 3 from medical emergencies, and 1 woman was shot and killed by police after she was allegedly part of the mob trying to force their way into the House chamber. Police also recovering 2 working pipe bombs at the Republican and Democratic Party headquarters, later safely detonating them. After the dust settled on one of democracy's darkest days, a bipartisan group of congressional leaders blaming one person for inciting the chaos: Donald Trump.
The president caused this. The president is unfit, and the president is unwell.
And now growing calls from leaders from both parties to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office just 13 days before his term expires.
A very dangerous person who should not continue in office.
And sources now tell ABC News that the president has discussed with his advisors, or rather suggested, that he would like to grant himself potentially a pardon here. Now, the laws on this are quite ambiguous, but constitutional attorneys and experts tell ABC that presidents cannot pardon themselves. Reporting in Washington, D.C. tonight, Andrew Dimbert, Denver7.
And breaking just a few minutes ago, Congresswoman Diana DeGette says the House is going to introduce articles of impeachment against the president. There are also reports that his cabinet is considering the 25th Amendment.
Denver7's Megan Lopez continues our 360 coverage tonight with perspective on how the next 2 weeks could play out. And Megan, I think a lot of people are wondering, could this actually happen?
Yeah, and a lot of people have that question. And, you know, the reality of this is that it would be difficult to do. Now, you heard from some members like Congressman Ken Buck, who said invoking the 25th Amendment would be difficult. It would set a bad precedent, and he doesn't support it. But Democratic members of the congressional delegation that I spoke with from Colorado say that it is necessary, it is possible, and that the events, the chaos of the Capitol yesterday are a good example of the danger that the president poses and why this is necessary. In the context of America's 244-year-old democracy, the 25th Amendment is the youngster in the room. Ratified in 1967, only used in a very few particular instances temporarily, and never due to a president's mental capacity. Basically, it allows the vice president to take over if the president dies or is disabled.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
After the president's speech Wednesday, after the chaos at the Capitol, and after the president's silence and then video telling the rioters he loved them,
He must be removed from office.
calls from top leaders of Congress for that amendment to be invoked. Even Colorado's Democrats say enough is enough.
He incited these people. He fomented this violence in many ways, and he whipped people into a frenzy.
This man has his hands on the nuclear codes, and I don't think we can trust him to run this country for the next 2 weeks.
For the president is a very dangerous person. He's a very violent person, and he's very unstable.
In my opinion, some of the things that he's done recently are insane.
But invoking the 25th Amendment is up to Vice President Mike Pence and the cabinet. And DU constitutional law professor Alan Chen says it's unlikely before the inauguration.
The real question here is timing. We have less than 2 weeks before the inauguration of Joe Biden, and the process sets a minimum time period.
The president is also allowed to dispute it, which would prolong the process. The other idea is another impeachment.
The impeachment would be something else and could potentially bar Donald Trump from ever running for office again.
We have to look at the timeline and what is possible, given that short period, and whether or not that it could extend beyond his term in office too. And we are conducting that assessment right now.
But again, Chen says that would be difficult.
Both of those approaches are unlikely to occur.
So once again, Representative DeGette said that they are going to go ahead and move forward with articles of impeachment. Now, something else is that you heard Representative Perlmutter say that if they do go through with impeachment and if the president is convicted, that it would be able to bar him from ever running from office again. I spoke with experts and they say that there is this kind of wonky scenario where they could continue with these articles of impeachment after the president leaves office, after inauguration, and go ahead for that exact purpose to bar him from going ahead and running for office again. But again, it's very unlikely and unprecedented at this point, guys.
All right, Megan Lopez. Thanks, Megan. And the response at the Capitol inspired some fierce debate among many of our followers on social media. And tonight, we continue our 360 reporting with perspectives on the police response.
Elizar wrote in to say, I cannot help but wonder what would the response have been from law enforcement if the crowd were a sea of people of color. President-elect Biden said the same thing in remarks today.
No one can tell me that if had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesting yesterday, they wouldn't have been treated very, very differently than the mob of thugs that stormed the Capitol. We all know that's true. And it is unacceptable. Totally.
Our next perspective, this is an important one. The elected leaders who are pushing misinformation about the people who stormed the Capitol. Alabama Congressman Mo Brooks put out a Twitter rant citing, quote, growing evidence that fascist Antifa orchestrated the Capitol attack. And we have gone through the evidence. We have listened to every word from Washington, D.C. police. There is no credible evidence that what Brooks is saying is true.
And then there's a perspective shared by lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. No one should overwhelm the police. Republican Lindsey Graham said this earlier today.
Most likely court-martialed. Yesterday, they could have blown the building up. They could have killed us all.
Capitol Police are already paying the consequences. The Capitol Police chief will resign next week. The House Sergeant of Arms at Arms resigned today. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is calling for the Senate Sergeant at Arms to do the same.
And as we mentioned earlier, President Trump has been suspended from Facebook and Twitter. Facebook chief Mark Zuckerberg said today that Trump's ban will last through Inauguration Day. In a statement today, he said the risks of allowing the president to continue to use our service during this period are simply too great.
Okay, you've heard the perspectives. What is yours? Please email it to us, 360@thedenverchannel.com. We read every email with an open mind.
It's been a while since Denver's had some snow. This cold front will likely change that.
Plus, we'll explain how Mile High Stadium could play a role in the state's vaccination effort.
And the folks in one Colorado town fight to preserve their quiet way of life.
If it happens, we'll roll with it. But, you know, we want to protect our space, our land, the peace.